I think we'd probably just might as well just start and kick off. There are quite a few of us still needing joining, but I think we will kick off and I'll pass you over to David Dundas. He is the expert and he'll show us what he would like us to know in this very interesting subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I will now share my screen. Can you all see that?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Great. That's already a good start. So I'm going to talk about I'm going to talk about nuclear power, and I think it is going to have a very important part of what we need to do to reach net zero fossil carbon emissions by 2050. So listen up and let's get started. First of all, nuclear fission is one type of nuclear power, and so is nuclear fusion. And the question is, what's the difference? So in fission power, as it sounds, you split the atoms in two, and you actually get a small loss of mass, and as a result, you get a large increase on emissions of energy. And if you see in the left-hand side, you've got a slow neutron is coming in, it's hitting uranium-235, which gets unstable, it transforms into uranium-236. The numbers indicate a neutron added, so 235 to 236 is an extra neutron, but that's very unstable, and it splits into krypton and barium with 3 fast neutrons coming out, which go on to do other things. Now, nuclear fission, we're not going to talk about that here. It's likely to become a very important power source for the whole world from about 2050 onwards, but for the moment it's very much experimental, and it could be the subject of another talk. So moving on. So nuclear fission power is basically this, as I mentioned before, the splitting of uranium-235. Let me just move that out of the way. So you can see on the right-hand side, this is obviously a stylistic way of representing it, but the nucleus, that's the bit in the center, the sun if you wish, contains 92 protons and 143 neutrons. The protons are positively charged, the neutrons are not charged, and the total adds up to 235. And if anybody wants to ask me why we have to have neutrons, I can explain that later. So the fissile material, which is going to actually do the work of being split and releasing energy, is actually only 0.72% of uranium ore. The uranium ore is pitchblende, which is uranium oxide. It's on the left there. That's a very nice crystal example of pitchblende. That is refined, purified, cleaned up, and becomes yellow cake. It's still uranium oxide. And this material melts at quite low temperatures. So it's melted, and then that becomes a gas. And the gas is passed through a series, a real cascade. You can see them on the left here, a long line of them, one after the other. The output of one goes into the input of the next one. And on the right, you can see a diagram of how a ultracentrifuge works. First point to note is this thing is running at very high speed, something like 50,000 revolutions a minute. The uranium fluoride gas comes in the top, this point here. It travels right the way down to the middle. It goes out, and the force of the centrifuge tends to separate the lighter 235 uranium, which is the one we want, because we want to enrich that from 0.72 up to about 4 or 5, from the uranium 238, which was the majority, which then goes out to the waste stream. The uranium 235 from this ultracentrifuge goes up and out and goes on to the next one. So it's a cascade. So recap what we saw before. A slow neutron comes in from a 238 neutron, which has been slowed down. We'll see how that happens in a minute. It decays, uranium 235 decays, as I was explaining, and you get krypton and barium. You get a loss of mass and a release of energy. The first nuclear reactors, the first one was this one in the Chicago pile, #1, and it was called a pile because actually it was a pile of graphite blocks. And the reason it was a pile of graphite blocks is because the graphite slows down the fast neutrons from uranium 238 so that they're slow enough to be captured by the uranium 235. Sorry. I also should mention that oxygen has a small molecular size. It's a small atom. So if you pair it with hydrogen, which is water, it becomes a good moderator. And as a result, most of the modern commercial reactors now running in the world use water to slow the neutrons down so they can be captured and cool the reactor at the same time. And this type of reactor is called a pressure water reactor. And you can also change the amounts of capture of the fast neutrons by adding boron to the water. The more boron you have, the slower will be the reaction. In other words, the reactivity, the rate of fission of the new uranium 235, because you want to be able to balance the rate of production of heat by the fission with the amount that you can absorb and transfer to heat steam to drive the turbines. In the world, we have something like 440 active nuclear reactors. As you can see, the majority of them are in the United States. Our nuclear reactors are fairly small, fairly well down on the table here. France has a lot of nuclear reactors, and in terms of the number of population, it's greater than the United States. 80% of France's electricity comes from nuclear power. In the UK, we have these reactors that are still running. And if you see on the left side here, this is an advanced gas-cooled reactor, meaning that it uses gas, it's carbon dioxide, to actually cool the reactor down. And down at the bottom, we have our only pressure water reactor, cooled with water, and the water also moderates. So the gas-cooled reactors here have graphite to moderate these high-speed electrons and slow them down so they can be captured by the uranium 235. So I break here for a little bit of question time because that's the principle of the nuclear fission. Any questions? No questions.
Can I just jump?
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, sorry. I did mean to say just before you started that should there be any questions, could we please put them into the chat function? But obviously, if there are any points that you'd like to make, obviously you can use the reaction button at the bottom of the screen, which obviously helps to note how many people are waiting. But as a question, David,
Yes.
I mean, obviously, you've shown us that those pictures of the pile, as it were, that seem to be quite a significant structure. But obviously, are nuclear reactors nowadays, not the pressure water reactors, but do they contain the graphite cores, the graphite rods in a way that helps to slow or speed up the reactor, as the case may be?
Yes. In fact, that is the point. If you look on this slide here, these advanced gas-cooled reactors are all moderated with carbon, with graphite. So the pressure water reactor that we have at Sizewell B is the only one which is moderated with water. If anybody else wants to ask a question, all they have to do is press the space bar, and that will allow that will unmute them. Shall I carry on?
You showed us a list of the countries where the reactors are located, but some of those countries are building new reactors while others are basically using up their existing stock and shutting them down. Can you tell us roughly where the new reactor construction is?
Sorry, could you repeat that? It was a bit quiet.
Oh, okay. I was asking, could you differentiate between the countries which have older reactors that are nearing the end of their life and the countries which are actually building new reactors from that list?
Unfortunately, I can't do that. I'm sure the information is available somewhere. The International Atomic Energy Agency would probably be able to answer that question online, I suspect, but I really don't know. What I can say is that the countries that were building nuclear reactors for generating power, the first ones like the United Kingdom, like France, like the United States, will have a large number of the older ones, I suspect, whereas and probably Russia as well, whereas other nations that are getting into this will, for example, the Far East, people like Japan, will have younger reactors. Does that answer your question sufficiently? I'm sorry, I can't give you that data.
David, there's another question from Sandy Taylor here. Saying, isn't a huge issue the question of the longevity of waste half-lives?
Yes, of course. This is why we would like to have nuclear fission producing long life radioactive materials, as short a life as possible. And as far as uranium is concerned, and uranium-235, we are stuck with materials, radioactive isotopes, which have extremely long lives, and it is an issue. This is why basically the world, I think it's reasonable to say that, is trying to pursue nuclear fusion, because nuclear fusion does not produce long-term radioactive byproducts. But in the meantime, we don't have much choice. We do need this extra nuclear power to get us to 2050, certainly in this country, where we don't have a lot of sun, for example. We have to make the best of it. And what we need to do is to work with designs which are the safest possible. And I have to say the pressure water reactor design is probably the safest around, which is why it's now being more and more widely used.
Okay, thank you, David. There's another question here which might cut into a little bit of your forthcoming presentation, but it says, this is from Tina Swani. What are the negative implications or impacts, as it were, resulting from extended and/or increased use of nuclear power?
Well, I think that the negative to that is, of course, we have more and more highly radioactive with very, very long half-life material that we have to store.
Okay, and does that is that a consideration that obviously has to be decided on at central government then?
I don't think so, because we've got to reach 2050 with zero fossil carbon emissions. And really, we have no other way of bridging the gap of the primary energy that the nation needs and the capabilities of all the renewables to actually meet that. They simply can't do it.
Okay.
Does that answer the question?
Yes. Tina, does that answer your question?
It does partly. It's I suppose the implications going from now to 2050. And good evening, everybody, as well. Right. Is I suppose, you know, I'm so new to all of this, and I hear nuclear power, and I you know, immediately many lay people like me who are very ignorant about nuclear power will go straight back to the impact of Chernobyl, so I suppose it's, you know, what is being done to address any fears and what is being done to address the negative, because yes, high level of radioactive material, but what's the implications of having that increased storage of radioactive material? What sort of a worst case scenario, or what is a sort of a likely risk that we would all be living with?
I think there are two parts of that question, if I may say so.
Thank you.
You mentioned Chernobyl, which I think is a reference really to the safety of nuclear power stations. And you also mentioned the storage of the radioactive waste. And the radioactive waste can be stored safely long term. It's unfortunate that we have to have it, but there are ways of actually using it in advanced nuclear reactor designs which can consume the stuff. But for the moment, that technology is not really available for running commercial nuclear reactors. About the stability and the safety of nuclear reactors, and you mentioned Chernobyl, that is a design which was gas cooled, and the particular design really didn't have a lot of safe features. It was an old design, and the pressure water reactors that I'm going to be talking about mainly, because they are probably the safest of all nuclear reactors that we should adopt. And the proof of it is that many nations that are building new reactors are all producing pressure water reactors. And later on in the presentation, I will talk about them and how they work, and you will see how they have an inherent stability. Chernobyl didn't. The Chernobyl accident was caused by operator error, which I could explain later on if you like, but it's a bit complicated. I don't know if that answers your question sufficiently.
Yes, thank you.
David, I think we could take just two more questions and then maybe allow you to move on. But one from Barbara Dundas. Why are the old UK reactors called Magnox reactors?
Oh, that's because it was magnesium aluminium designed for the fuel cans.
Okay, and I think this last question for this particular session, it's rather long and might be best included in your sort of discussion, but it says, having lived through the 2011 Fukushima disaster when I was living in Japan, the operation of nuclear facilities for profit worries me, as operators are tempted to cut corners on the safety front in order to maximize profits and dividends to investors. Is there a case to run these as not-for-profit organizations? And that's a question that was placed by Hugh Ashton.
Hugh, good evening. It's a valid point. I think the first reply to that is probably, if you're wise, you don't build a nuclear reactor or a power station right next to the sea where you're likely to have tsunamis coming in, which is what they did. The reason for them being placed close to the sea is actually the water. The ocean water is used to cool the steam from the steam turbines. But what you can do, of course, is install them further inland and use cooling towers with the same result. But they cost a lot more money to build. And of course, they're also liable to be damaged by hurricanes and the like. But that is an issue. Where do you locate your nuclear power station? All our future ones, the ones that I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is actually operating, the Sizewell B, but all the future ones that are being designed to be built, the UK has basically committed to a long-term plan of building 8 of them. They will all be located close to the sea to use the ocean as the cooling medium. Does that satisfy your question, Hugh? He's probably
not really, I'm afraid. But as has been said, I think it probably is a discussion for a later period in this lecture. So anyway, thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much. So we'll allow David to continue with his presentation. Thanks for those questions.
Okay, thank you very much. And let's have a look at some actual power stations and how they work. So this is Sizewell B, which I mentioned to you already. This is our only pressurized water reactor. It's located, I think it's off the Essex coast, and it uses the seawater to cool it down. You may have heard of plans to build a Sizewell C, which has been the subject of some political discussion. I think it will go ahead soon. And the letter C is because it's similar to the Hinkley Point C power station, which is presently under construction. It will be the same design, but the Sizewell C will have 2 reactors, whereas Sizewell B only has 1. You can see the heat output is 3,500 megawatts, but by the time that's been converted into electric power, you lose about 2/3, and so the electric power output is 1,195. As you can see, it was built in 1988. Well, started built in 1988, and it will be closed in 2035. So how does a power station with a pressurized water reactor like Sizewell B work? This is obviously a drawing of the scheme of it. On the left, you've got the fuel elements. This is the nuclear reactor itself with all the fuel elements there. And the water that cools it down is in 2 circuits. There's a primary circuit, which are these arrows here, which is running at high pressure and high temperature. It needs to be under high pressure to keep it from boiling. It's liquid water at 345 degrees Celsius and a pressure of 155 bar, which is just over 2,000 pounds per square inch. So the water flows up along here. It then flows down the side here, up through the gaps between the fuel elements, the fuel ones, which you'll see in a minute. It comes out and it goes round and it goes through the heat exchanger, which is the steam generator, which takes in water here, and the water is boiled and off goes the steam to run the generators. The whole system is enclosed in a very, very strong concrete containment shield. If there is a danger from nuclear reactors, it's not a danger that they're going to explode like a bomb, but that the heating gets out of hand and melts the fuel that's in the fuel element, and then that needs to be contained before it can actually escape as it did in Chernobyl, into the atmosphere. So this is it in more detail. On the left-hand side, you've got your reactor. And to explain some of the components, the water is coming in here on the left, and again goes down to the bottom, up through the reactor core. And these green things here, they're not actually green in reality, of course, are the control rods. And these are the control rod mechanisms that lower the control rods in or pull the control rods out. And they are used to actually slow down and eventually shut down the reactor. The water comes out here. It goes, as you can see in this one, it's coming here from the coal, well, if it comes here, it starts around here, comes over through here. This is a powerful pump, and it's coming in at something like 290 degrees Celsius into the reactor. It's heated up at 325 Celsius, and then it goes off into that steam generator and round again. The pressure is maintained so that it doesn't boil by this pressurizer. Sizewell B has actually got 4 steam generators. They're all inside this strong building, and you can see these are the blue lines of the water that goes back into the steam generator to be, well, sorry, excuse me, that's the water coming out. The red line is the water going in from the reactor, and so it goes round and round in the circuit. If one of the steam generators could fail, which might be, for example, if the pump stops working, there are still 3 more to carry on the work. So the main systems to control the rate of production of heat, the reactivity of the reactor, which is the rate of fission of the uranium, there are 3 things in question here. The cooling water is a moderator, and the more moderator you have, if you like, the more it will slow down fast neutrons. It's not an issue in a pressure water reactor because it's always full of water, but it becomes an issue in a boiling water reactor where they're boiling the water to steam within the reactor. So the cooling water slows down those neutrons to allow the uranium to capture it. The control rods capture neutrons. They don't do anything, they just simply absorb them. And the boron that you might add to the water also captures neutrons. So if you want to have a large amount of neutron capture, you don't have to rely just on the control rods. You can also have more boron dissolved in the water. And what tends to happen is that when the reactor starts up with a new charge of uranium fuel, you will have the maximum production of heat, the maximum production of slow neutrons, and so on. So the boron is added to the water at the start to capture those neutrons. And as the fuel is used up, the boron concentration is reduced. There's a separate plant, which I'm not going to show here, which actually adjusts the amount of boron in the water. So going into the detail of how all of that's built, inside the reactor, they are what they call these fuel skeletons. There are some 260 in the reactor at Sizewell B, and they're made up of these fuel skeletons where you've got a load of fuel pins, these blue items here on the left, and this is an individual fuel pin which contains pellets of the uranium fuel held down with a spring. They're all loaded in here, lots and lots of them, and you can actually see from the top, this top nozzle, which is this part on the right, they are loaded into the slots that you can see here. The control rods, which are these on the right, they're made up of silver, indium, and cadmium, inside stainless steel tubes. They are lowered down through these holes. And if you look down on the top, this is what the configuration of the holes are, and see it lines up here. And then you've got passageways of water which manage to get through between these fuel pins. Because they're round, there's just enough room for the water to get through. So, any questions so far? Peter.
David, there's another question from Megan Jenkins. Can you tell us anything more about the new possible nuclear site at Ratcliffe-on-Soar in Nottingham?
No, I can't. In fact, I don't know of that site. It's possible it's not one of these large-scale power stations. It might be a small power station because Nottingham is not exactly near the sea, and all the 8 reactors that are planned for construction are all going to be located next to the sea. You might remember there was one that was abandoned up near Seascale in Cumbria, and there are others around the country, but I'm not aware of this one in Nottingham. If you could find out exactly where it is or what it's called, I could investigate, but I don't know about that one.
Phil Mackley here. If I could just interrupt, I think I'm not sure whether Ratcliffe-on-Soar has been proposed as being the site for a fusion development, not a fission development, but I may be wrong.
Thanks, Phil. That's a very good point. The situation is that continuing design and development of fusion power is going ahead, and the government is actually going to give subsidy for the development of the next stage of a fusion reactor. There's even some hope that Lichfield District Council might put in a bid to have one built in Lichfield District. So I imagine a lot of different councils are having a go to get the reactor built in their area. But as you say, it sounds as though it's like a fusion reactor. Peter.
Yeah, David, there's a comment and a question effect by Sandy Taylor again. It's quite very reasonable in the respect that he says nuclear power such as Hinkley Point is now regarded as insanely expensive on an untried model. It is regarded as the most expensive energy plant in the world due to its strike price for electricity agreed with the government. Is this really sustainable?
I think the problem here is that the Hinkley Point, which is being built, and I'll show you some pictures about that a little later on in the presentation, has tried to introduce lots of new safe technology, and it suffered from delays in the construction of the buildings, not so much the reactor and its various components, the pumps and so on. It's the building itself, which has to be very, very strong. It's double walled and requires very, very high specification of work. And you'll see later on as well, I'm going to mention, in fact, the next slide will be about the power station at Flamanville in France, where it's the same sort of design. And that's been under construction now for 13 years and has run into problems because of the quality of the steel. So it's not so much the quality of the design, but this is the reason why that the price for Hinkley Point C is now projected as being 23 billion pounds, which is huge. Nice. What they're hoping to do is the next in the series, that's the Sizewell C, will be the same design. And by repeating what they've done at Hinkley Point, they will achieve some substantial cost savings. In fact, the more that they build of the same design, they should get very much greater cost savings, and they should get it down to probably a third or a quarter of the price of Hinkley Point C. That is the hope.
That's very good, David. I think we probably ought to learn a little bit from the French. I know we, as British, we tend not to regard the French very highly, but they have established a very good network of nuclear power stations. In fact, I noticed that a couple of your slides are attributed to EDF. Are we to learn from them, do you think?
Well, first of all, they already run all of our nuclear power stations in this country. Secondly, 80% of their electricity, that's huge. I mean, in this country, our total generation of all types of electricity is only 15% of our energy. The nuclear part in this country is probably something like 10 or 15%, but in France it's 80%. So they have got a lot of experience in running reactors and therefore the design. But having said that, and unless there are any other questions, I can move onto the French Flamanville power station and we can talk about it.
Yes, I think that's fine, David. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Here it is. Flamanville, the top right-hand picture there you can see is just off the Normandy coast. There's Guernsey, there's Jersey, there's Flamanville. Now, why is it Flamanville 3? Why? Because it's the third. And this picture here of it, it's not finished, it's nearing completion, but it's taken a long time to get this point, is this dome here. If it wasn't there, you'd see the other two, because in fact, this will be the third located at this particular site. Here is a drawing on the left of that one. And as you can see, there's this very strong wall here. And between the inner and the outer, they actually, to make sure they've got no leaks of radioactivity and so on, they do extract the air from there and it's filtered before going up the chimney. And the chimney is this one you can see on the right. It's a big one. Here you can see 4,300 megawatts T, and by the way, that means thermal, so heating power. And that's going to produce 1,650 megawatts of electricity. When it's going to be finished, one doesn't know. I rather hope it's within the next few years. So moving on, this is a model of Hinkley Point C when it's finished in two directions. As you can see, it's right next to the sea, which will be used to cool the water coming from the steam turbines. It has two pressure water reactors, but because it's following on from the French designs, instead of calling them pressurized water reactors, they call them European power reactors. French like to be independent, but then they're bringing the technology, so I guess they're entitled to do that. The first building of Hinkley Point C is under construction. Sorry, excuse me, the second. The first one is on the left-hand side, this one over here. You can just see the dome. This is the second one, and it's under construction. So they're getting on pretty well, and they're hoping to have the power station operational and connected to the grid in 2025. That's the same construction work at night, and the blue pipes here are leading the heated, well, the heat steam. It's the, I think in fact these are inlet pipes for the water. The steam pipes come out higher up to go off to drive the turbines. So this is a summary of what is expected of Hinkley Point C. As I mentioned, the cost is considerable at £23 billion. We hope to have it working in 2025, and it should have a useful life of 60 years. Two pressurized water reactors. It will generate a total amount of heat of 3,260 megawatts of electricity. Sorry, excuse me, electricity. It's the heat is 2.8 times that. That's only if it runs 24 hours, 7 throughout the year. And of course, load factor, I think that's fairly ambitious. EDF says that they're going to run it 90% of the time. So the net electric power will be something like nearly 3,000 megawatts of power. If you multiply that up by the number of hours in a year, some 8,600, I think, you'll produce 25.67 terawatt hours, which is quite a lot. But then you have to see that it's only a small fraction of the primary energy that the United Kingdom needed in 2019. Here is another plan or diagram of Sizewell C, very, very similar to Hinkley Point. As you can see in the middle, you've got the reactor, and then you've got the 4 steam generators, and there's a pump. There's another pump you can see there, and the steam coming out of the top goes off to drive the turbines. Now, there's an alternative to these big ones, and one of the questions earlier was about the alternatives. They are huge, the big reactors like Hinkley Point C. The alternative is to have small modular reactors. These are already being used in such things as nuclear submarines. So there's a lot of knowledge and technology available. They are quite small, relatively speaking. They can be taken to the site where they're going to operate on heavy transport. And here's some examples of those. The Rolls-Royce one that you saw on the left, what you saw on the left was simply the reactor, which is this part here. These 4 grey things are the steam generators, and the grey one at the back is the pressurizer. And here are the 4 very powerful pumps. Uses 4.8% enriched uranium so that it will work. 4.8% of the uranium-235, that is. An American company called NuScale, they've set up an office in this country, so they're very optimistic. They've designed this reactor. I'll show a bit more detail on the next slides. But it's quite small. So you compare 77 megawatts of electricity compare with 440 megawatts. Their idea is to have a number of those in the same location rather than one big one. There are other ways of cooling the reactors. This one is a sodium metal cooled. It's liquid metal that's operating up to 600 degrees Celsius. And there are some advantages in that kind of design, because you can actually generate hydrogen directly using high temperatures from a nuclear reactor. This one here on the right is cooled by molten lead. And they have different kinds of compounds uranium, but they still work on the principle of splitting uranium-235. In this case, it's uranium nitride. So this is the NuScale concept. And when I say concept, they haven't actually built one, which is unfortunate. This is the way things are at the moment. A lot of ideas, but no concrete equipment. This particular one shows 5 reactors here of the type that you saw on the other page. And here's the detail on the right. They're also talking about installations that may have as many as 10 or a dozen. And the advantage of that is, of course, they can actually have one that's not running, being refueled, being serviced and brought back in, and then have the others 4 running, so they can work in a kind of leapfrog manner. So in this case, you've got 5. Each one is producing 77 megawatts of heat. So you're getting very close to that single Rolls-Royce design. What's interesting about this one, it doesn't have any pumps to pump around the cooling fluid. It works on the basis of thermosiphon, that is the difference in density between the hot fluid and the cold. So in the center, you've got your reactor, and the reactor heats up the cooling liquid, the cooling water, which travels up over the top. And in this area, this heats up the steam. The steam pipe comes in from the outside and goes out, but this heats up the steam. And in doing that, the water falls to the very bottom and then comes up the center and round. So there are no electric pumps to fail, which adds a bit of extra safety. There are some modular reactors running around the world. Some of these are quite old, so the idea is not exactly new. What will be new is to roll out a large number of them, because we will be needing to re-engineer our existing gas-fired power stations, and small modular reactors will be able to be produced in a factory, taken to them, uninstalled, and they would then replace the gas-fired boilers. So you can see up here, Pakistan and China, interesting that they're working together on that. India, Siberia, Russia. So fairly old technologies. And here's some examples of the small modular reactor designs. It's a gas-cooled reactor here. The lead-cooled, which we already mentioned. Molten salt, this is an interesting concept where you actually dissolve your uranium oxide in the molten salt, which could be just simple sodium chloride, ordinary salt. There's that liquid sodium cooled reactor. This is a boiling water reactor where the reactor itself boils the water, which goes off and generates, runs the steam turbines. And on the left is one which is a very high pressure water cooled reactor. This to me is a very interesting slide. It was produced by Catapult Energy Systems, who are actually located in Birmingham, and they're looking at the primary energy on the left here. That is the energy that is produced in a country. This is for the United Kingdom. And on the right is how it's consumed. So the difference between the left side and the right side is the loss of the energy through poor insulation and for inefficient machines and so on. What's interesting that they are predicting by 2050 here, although wind is going to have a large amount of the primary energy production, compare that with 2020, it's going to increase hugely. But this bit here, the brown, that is nuclear power. So they are predicting that there will be more energy coming from nuclear power than from wind by 2050, which I find very interesting. So here we go, conclusions. We've got 440 power stations around the world. According to the previous slide, the energy catapult in the UK, we're going to need around 2,400 terawatt hours of nuclear heating power by 2050, which will supply 1,250 terawatt hours of primary energy. Last year, the primary energy, all the energy, that's every source, coal, coke, everything, last year was around 2,260 terawatt hours. By the way, a terawatt hour is enormous. That's a million watts of primary energy, multiplied by the number of hours in a year. So the pressurized water reactors are the preferred proven safe technology, and they use enriched uranium 235 up to 4.5%, 4 to 5% within the rest of the uranium, which is uranium 238. So we may see some other technologies like molten salt and sodium cooled, and they may be specialist applications. This high temperature use of producing water is most interesting for the future. I don't think there's anybody doing it yet, except probably in the laboratory. If you heat up your electrolysis equipment, which is producing splitting the hydrogen, the water into hydrogen and oxygen, if you keep it hot, you reduce the consumption of electricity, you make it more efficient. This is something to do with thermodynamics, and please don't ask me to give you the maths on that. Any questions?
Thank you, David. That's been a brilliant exposition of, in short, very, very condensed, unfortunately, to give us an idea of what nuclear energy or fission nuclear energy can hold for us. There is a question here, which in fact rather preempted my questions, by Victoria Yardley. And the question was, how able are nuclear power stations to deal with variable demand and variable supply from other sources, for example, solar or wind? If they are more suited to constant operation, are there plans to develop infrastructure for storage using battery farms or similar? That's a very good question, I think.
It is indeed a very good question, Peter. Thank you very much. The whole production, distribution and use of electricity is a problem. And you might recall a few years ago that there was some concern because of the lack of sufficient electric power in this country. And that was precipitated by a loss of electric power, particularly in the southeast, which was caused by some technical faults on the transformers. And in order to boost the amount of available electric power, it's very important to be able to store the energy in the off periods. And there's a lot of work going on to build huge battery farms nearby. The nearest one to us, the project is in Oxford. The Oxford City Council has decided to get very carbon free, and they're building a huge battery farm there using batteries so that the power can be stored during the off-peak times and then brought back to the grid when the demand rises. And you're right to say that it's more difficult to vary the output of a nuclear power station. It can be done, they can be slowed down, they can be speeded up, but not very, very quickly. And very often the power demand over 24 hours can vary hugely all at the same time. So people get up in the morning, they put on the kettle and so on. The demand for electric power jumps hugely. The nuclear power stations cannot react fast enough. But equally, on the other side of the equation, the wind power, the wind doesn't always blow. And the sun obviously doesn't shine at night. And there is a need for the so-called renewables to have their electricity stored in batteries as well. Of course, in batteries, there's only one way of doing it. You can do it in other ways. For example, as probably most of you have heard, we're going to need to produce a huge amount of hydrogen, because hydrogen is a carrier of energy, just like hydrocarbons that you presently put in your car to drive it or to power your gas boiler in the house. They are carried, hydrogen is carried on the back of carbon. If you can have hydrogen alone, when you use it, combining it with oxygen from the air, it only produces water or steam, which is done in a fuel cell. So hydrogen is going to be an extremely important part of our energy supply in the future. We need to produce huge amounts. And by the same token, what we can do is store the hydrogen that's produced in the off-peak times. The power stations continue to run, but instead of just slowing them down or stopping them, you can continue to make hydrogen with an electrolyzer, and then you store the hydrogen. So the whole balance of the output of power from the power sources, how you contain the variation between the peak demands and the low demands, batteries will play an important part, but hydrogen stored will also do the same thing. In some other countries where hydrogen is being used much more widely for powering, for example, cars, like in Germany, the hydrogen is usually stored at fair pressure, but not huge pressure, in large tanks at the filling stations. And this can be produced during the off periods and then supplied to the cars during the day. Does that answer the question?
Victoria, does that help you?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Very comprehensive answer.
Thank you, thank you. Now, Sandy Taylor has made a couple of points, which might be better if, Sandy, do you want to address those points and ask David accordingly, please?
Right, yes. I've got some worries really about nuclear energy, but I just wanted to touch on the small scale reactors you mentioned. There are a couple of questions around them. What's the life of these reactors? How are they going to be disposed of? And also, if they're small, they could be spatially distributed, but what are the spatial safeguards about those close to centres of population?
Thanks for that question. Well, the answer is that they will obviously run for as long as they've got fissile material in them, which is used up. And when they need to be refurbished, as it were, they're not thrown away, they're taken back to factory where they're refurbished, refilled with new fissile material and taken back to where they were. And you might remember there was a slide of NuScale where they had a number of these small modular reactors in a kind of a kind of tank. That is so that they can take the reactors, any one of them, out, send them off for reprocessing, and bring other ones to replace them. So there is a way to keep refueling them, but in a safe environment, in a controlled condition of a factory.
Can I just follow up? Presumably then, when the fissile material is taken out of them, it has to be disposed of somewhere. And also, I'm still a bit concerned about what the safeguards are in terms of if you have some of these small reactors much closer to the point of use of the energy around big centres of population. Have there been some design safeguards mapped out for those?
Well, yes, most of them are of the pressure water reactor type, of the type that I explained, like Hinkley Point C. And they have an extremely good track record for no accidents. In fact, if you compare the accident rate of the heating power produced and electric power as well of nuclear power stations in this country compared with gas-fired power stations, nuclear power stations have almost no accidents at all. So they are proven to be very reliable. Having said that, one should not take advantage of them or neglect them. You still have to be very careful and know what you're doing. But I would agree that there will be some concern about bringing them too close to large population areas. And so the compromise will have to be made on that subject. But since these ones are quite small compared with the very large nuclear power stations like Hinkley Point C, obviously the danger is somewhat reduced in the event of an accident. But nevertheless, it is a concern.
Thank you. Is that okay, Sandy, with you?
Yes, I take what David's saying. I think there still is a big communication issue if there is going to be widespread use of small-scale reactors. But I'll leave that point there at the moment.
I think you're right, by the way, Sandy, if I might come back on that. You might remember, well, you might know, I'm pretty sure you know what an MRI scan is used in clinical diagnosis. The MRI scan, the original name of it was a nuclear magnetic resonance device. And they had to change it to MRI from nuclear because people didn't like the thought of it being nuclear. So nuclear tends to be a bad word, which we have to try to dispel as a problem through good education.
Thank you. Thank you, David. If we could move on, there's another question from Hugh Ashton, which was, can you please tell us a little about thorium reactors, David, please?
Yes, I purposely didn't include it here because I'm constrained a bit on time, but thorium is a very interesting fissile material. It's, in its natural state, it's 4 times more abundant than uranium on the Earth, but it will not actually work as fissile material right away. You first have to bombard it with neutrons to transmute it. And this can actually be done, believe it or not, with some of the radioactive wastes from the existing nuclear power stations. But once you've got it going, it is a very good idea. And thorium reactors would take various forms. And one of the popular form is to actually have the thorium material used in a molten salt reactor, where the thorium is in there and it circulates around as a cooling medium as well. It's quite an interesting design, a little bit beyond the scope of this particular meeting, but something that we need to keep an eye on because I think they will become more and more used over the next 30 years.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David. We've got a few other questions here. There's one from Beat Pezian. Is that correctly pronounced? I'm not very good at that. But it said, I'm reluctant to accept that nuclear power is unavoidable when Germany will switch off the nuclear power stations completely by 2022, as it were, whilst moving to renewable power by 2050. In fact, that brings up another question which I would like to add, which is basically if Germany and France are the powerhouse, as it were, within the EU, how do they equate their different positions from that point of view?
Oh, very interesting question. But verging on the politics. Basically, yeah. Why has France got so much nuclear power? The reason is primarily because they lost a lot of their supply of oil from Algeria. And we're looking now, how many years ago? 50 years ago, I guess. And in fact, I remember one of the presidents of France in his election campaign before he became president, and I don't remember which one it was, he was very much anti-nuclear. That was his platform. And I was in Paris in a hotel visiting a customer and staying overnight in my room and watching the television. And there was an 1.5-hour program on the French television about how nuclear power was a wonderful thing. So this particular president, having been elected, turned around 180 degrees, and that's when they started building lots and lots of nuclear power stations. Turning to Germany, I think they made a mistake. Why? They don't like nuclear power. So what they're doing now is they're importing gas to replace it, or they have been for some time. and they're bringing the gas from Russia. And the Russians have been building more power stations in order to release natural gas to send to Western Europe. And so in effect, what they're doing, what the Germans have done, is to transfer nuclear power from Germany into Russia. And you have to ask yourself if that's a good idea. Having said that, I think that the political situation in Germany is such that they probably can't now start building nuclear power stations. So what are they going to do about it? Because they're going to have a big hole in their clean energy sources. And the Germans almost certainly will be relying on a huge amounts of hydrogen. That's quite evidenced already. But they won't be able to produce a lot of hydrogen if they're producing it from electricity, which generated in a gas-fired power station, gas coming from Russia. So they're going to find an alternate. An alternative, of course, initially is wind power and solar power, but there just isn't enough space on their land and even offshore Germany to produce the energy that they require. So they're going to start importing hydrogen from Saudi Arabia. And actually, I think there are 5 North Sea ports in Germany which have been got ready to receive bulk hydrogen in tankers. And where's this hydrogen coming from? Well, the Saudis have realized the writings on the wall that they're not going to be able to export oil within the next 30 years. They're going to have to stop it altogether. But they've got vast areas of desert. So they are building a new city up just off the Red Sea, not far from the Israeli border, as a matter of fact, called Neom. And Neom is primarily going to be designed to have huge fields nearby of solar capture. I think it's going to be solar voltaic, but it might be solar thermal. And that energy will be used to produce bulk hydrogen, huge quantities of hydrogen. And the American company, Air Products, which is a very big company in industrial gases, is already planning to import that hydrogen into the United States, not as hydrogen itself, but actually on the back of nitrogen as ammonia. So they will be bringing in liquid ammonia in big tanks to the United States. So the answer to the question for Germany probably is they will import lots and lots of hydrogen. Whether we'll be able to import hydrogen as well to fill our gap is not certain, but certainly as far as I know, the powers that be, the people who calculate these things, are not actually counting on that. Does that answer the question?
Well, I think that was very comprehensive. Beatty, are you happy with that answer? I think that was quite a significant answer, but we'll move on to another question, which from Peter Mayer, and this is, will climate change lead to problems with water cooling?
I don't quite understand the question, Peter. Why would climate change lead to problems of water cooling? Does it mean the heating up of the water, for example, the oceans? Is that what he's referring to?
I would think so. I think that's what Peter would mean. Peter, is that correct?
He's probably muted.
He is. Peter?
It's all right. I was pressing the space bar, which clearly wasn't working. So there are 2 parts of the question. One is the one you've identified, which is the heating up of water, which seems to be accelerating at the moment, faster than was expected from climate change. And the other is with so many coastal buildings, whether just the rise of water itself will affect the efficiency and efficacy of these new power stations.
Okay, on the first one, I think it's generally accepted that the oceans are increasing in temperature, which is the very reason why it's been decided at the United Nations level that we absolutely must halt the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is causing global warming. And of course, the oceans of the Earth are huge heat banks, if you like. They stabilize the temperature, and they will be influenced very strongly by the increase in temperature of the average temperatures of the climate on the Earth. This is having huge effects on wildlife, and clearly we have to stop that. The second question, I wasn't quite sure that I understood what it was. It was about buildings, I think. Could you elaborate, please?
Because the new power stations are being built in coastal areas, and there is distinct worry about the loss of land that's going to occur in especially United Kingdom, but other areas as well. Has that been taken into account in the new sites that are going ahead at the moment?
The erosion.
I think you must be referring to the potential for these nuclear power stations to heat up the oceans. Clearly, they will add a little bit of heat, but I think the amount of heat that they will add is so small compared with, for example, the heat from the sun, that it can be discarded. I don't think anybody's worked out what that might be, what the impact might be. Yes, in effect, the water around these power stations near the outlet would possibly increase a bit in temperature, and that might cause a change in wildlife.
Thank you, Peter. Is that helpful to you?
Yes, thank you. Answers the question. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got another question from Faith Hall, who is joined us from the Bahamas. I mean, we have a very eclectic range of people, and we're very happy to welcome her. The question is, will part of the presentation address the cost of electricity to consumers as the world moves away from fossil fuels and embraces nuclear energy?
Well, the answer to your question is no, because we've now finished the presentation, but I can give you my thoughts on the subject. You might be aware that the renewables of solar and wind and tide and so on, the cost of the electricity produced by them is going down hugely. I think the cost of wind and solar has gone down by 75% over the last 10 years. It's now got to a point where it's actually cheaper to make electricity by the renewables than it is to build a new gas power station. So I think that we will see cost reductions. Sorry, I'm getting an interference in the background here. Can you hear that?
Yes, I'm afraid so.
Okay, well, it's gone away. So I think it was my mobile in another room. So does that start to answer your question? And by the way, thank you for calling in from the Bahamas. I wish we were there.
Yes, here.
Does that answer the question?
Faith, is that a reasonable answer?
Yes, thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got another question from Councillor Jackie Taylor, and this is more numerical, but with EDF electricity, obviously from France, is that cheaper than Scottish Power?
Well, first of all, Scottish Power is using renewables at the moment. The electricity from EDF is probably more expensive. The problem that we face as a nation, and in actual fact for the whole world to a degree, is that in order to reach net zero fossil fuel carbon emissions by 2050, we've got to generate a lot more fossil-free electricity over the next 29 years. And in this country, in the United Kingdom, we just don't have enough space to have a lot more photovoltaic cells, more wind farms, and even emergent technologies like tidal stream technologies. We just don't have enough to meet the bill. The renewables last year contributed about 8% of the total energy required by this country. And you just can't scale them up by that amount. We could imagine having 5 times as many solar farms, wind farms, and so on. But even that would not meet the total. And if you remember, there was a slide, in fact, I'll go back, see if I can find that. This slide here, this is the estimate of the catapult energy systems, where they're showing what they expect wind to be contributing. In this country, very little solar, you can imagine that. But they feel that the large slice will be nuclear. And it's simply, we don't have enough time to bridge this gap and have all our energy fossil free over the next 29 years. We just need nuclear to fill the gap. And hopefully by 2050, you'll see the emergence of nuclear power by fusion technology. And fusion technology leaves almost no radioactive waste, and what they do leave is very short-lived. It's the holy grail of energy, but it's not available today. And if you're interested in that technology, or anybody else, I suggest that you look at the website of ITER, ITER.org, and there will explain to you what fusion energy is about and the massive, huge experimental power station, or power source, I should say at this stage, that they are building. You might even call it an 11th wonder of the world, and it's a tribute to cooperation between the major powers in the world, China, Japan, United States, this country through the European Union. All these different nations are contributing and building components for this wonderful thing. So anybody who's interested in fusion power, the holy grail of energy, do have a look at ITER.
Okay, thank you, David. Maybe fusion power will be another subject that we can discuss at a later session. We've got another question from Andrew here. It says, what are the options regarding dealing with nuclear waste? How long is it dangerous for? And are there any new technologies that might be able to deal with it on the horizon?
Okay, question 1. It is very long-lived. The one with the longest half-life, I think, has 22,000 years or something like that. Quite awesome. I'm not a specialist in this particular area, but it does have to be held in very secure underground sites, in very secure containers. What is generally done is the waste is vitrified. That is to say, it's composed in glass, so that should there be a hole in the container, although the containers are very robust, it can't leak out. But nevertheless, it have to be stored in a secure way. And some of this stuff is very radioactive, so it's difficult to handle as well, which is why we need to get away from nuclear fission power, which is what I've been talking about, and get on to nuclear fusion power. And hopefully by 2050, we will start seeing the emergence of the first nuclear fusion power stations. But it'll only be the first. We need a lot more time to build all the rest that the world needs.
Thank you, David. We're quickly sort of coming towards the end of our time, but I think one last topic we can just touch on really. Ian Shardlow brought up quite a few points, and this in fact encapsulates, I think, why nuclear power is becoming really possibly important to discuss and to explore. But Ian, would you like to take the question forward about the overall energy consumption in the world?
Yeah, just a basic one. We're building more and more power stations, but isn't a key thing to actually do something to reduce consumption? Like in the UK, we have some of the worst housing in terms of insulation. One or two people have also asked is, would it be more economic to invest the however many £1 billion of a nuclear power station in insulating houses? Has anybody done the sort of cost benefit of all those sorts of things?
Thanks, Ian. A very worthy question. Basically what it is, the energy consumption, the energy requirements of the world, the developed nations, is going to increase by about 30% between now and 2050. That's the energy need. But because we are doing better insulation, we're having more efficient machines and so on and so forth, we're saving energy. And as a result, the net requirement is not increasing 30%. And you can see on this, this graphic that I've got on the screen at the moment, if you look at 2020, the total energy required, primary energy and what was required, and you compare it with 2050, on the left-hand side, this is the consumption of the energy, and it falls all the way down to 2050 because of improving insulation and more efficient machines. But in order to produce the energy, you need to have, to actually use that energy, you need to have all of this is produced. So we still need to produce a lot more. We need to do both. We need to produce a lot more energy, and it needs to be fossil free, but we also have to insulate our houses, stop the loss of energy, have more efficient machines that use less energy. And developments in that way are going on all the time. I think houses are a major problem, or rather say buildings, but particularly houses. They consume a huge amount of energy to heat them. And so insulating houses is, in this country, in the United Kingdom, is going to be very, very important. And in actual fact, it's something that we can start doing. Well, we're already doing it to a degree, but hugely increase the amount of insulation of houses, using probably a lot of people who've lost their jobs following COVID, because it doesn't require a lot of training to have people starting to insulate the lofts of houses, install double glazing where it's not there, or even triple glazing, and so on. It's something that we need to do alongside increasing the amount of electricity that comes from non-fossil sources.
Thank you, David. I think we can probably stop there, although there are many other points that have been brought up. Maybe if we could pass them to you, you could answer the questions in succession by email or letter. I think.
Peter.
Pardon?
I'd be very glad to do that. If you could pass the questions on to me, I'll do my best to answer them.
Yeah, thank you very much. Wow, I mean, this has been a fantastic meeting. I mean, it's one that obviously has generated a lot of interest and a lot of discussion. I think there are certainly many more people who are getting interested in the subject, because it's the well, it's the future we're looking at, really. And again, if we use the good old principle of the Lunar Society, heritage for the future, we've got to learn from what went on in the past to apply to the future. But in my rush to get us started, and you can see why I did rush, because the meeting was really quite full. I never told you that David really started in chemistry and biochemistry from St. Andrews way back in 1964, but his various jobs and iterations have led him to develop quite an encyclopedic knowledge of energy supply, energy production, and the various elements leading to climate change. That climate change itself is a subject that we are hoping to take up in the Lunar Society. It's quite a big topic, especially with the forthcoming COP26 conference in Glasgow, if that still goes ahead, that is. But again, it remains for me to thank David and all the participants in this evening. We do like new members. It's always very good to see new faces and people from quite a widespread across the world. I think Bahamas does take the biscuit from that point of view. It's really good. And we are always keen to engender more discussion. Just as a closing remark, I'm pleased to tell you that we are in our climate change discussion. I have been able to include a very important person who is on the Climate Change Committee here in England, is Julia King, the Baroness Brown of Cambridge. She's a very well-respected engineer and has had multiple postings within the engineering community with Rolls-Royce itself, and has been a very big advocate for the approach towards climate change. She is going to talk to us on the 30th of September at 6:30 again. This is hopefully going to be a discussion in person. Hopefully COVID will allow us to hold it at Aston University, but part of the presentation will be also online by Zoom format. So if you put that in your diaries, 30th of September at 6:30, it's another Thursday, and it should be another bumper discussion, which will lead quite nicely onto COP26 in November. Again, I'm very pleased that we have all been able to attend and hopefully stay all awake. But thank you, David, again. Thank you all for attending, and good night. Thank you very much.